There are hundreds of books, articles, documentaries, and podcasts exploring the link between mental illness and violence, and just as many exploring the link between mental illness and homelessness, or mental illness and you pick the topic. Mental illness can clearly be a devastating condition affecting not only those so afflicted, but often their loved ones, and sadly sometimes their victims. So why one more report? What can I say that hasn't already been said? I can only assume that most violent incidences in which mental illness is suspected of playing a role are isolated and involve relatively few people. That does not make them any less terrifying to those involved, nor any less deserving of sympathy. They are simply seldom reported to a large audience and therefore remain unknown to most. What is reported nationally here in the United States, and unfortunately politicized to no end, are large-scale assaults. Here is an incomplete list of some well-publicized shootings. Each of these incidences involved rapid-fire semi-automatic weapons in both rifle and pistol configurations. Many, if not most, of the suspected perpetrators were reported to have been taking psychotropic prescription medication for diagnosed mental issues. Is there a link? I honestly don't know, but why wouldn't it bear exploring? If you have been paying even the slightest attention to current events in the last 20 years, none of this should come as a surprise. Indeed, its repetitive nature at ever-shrinking intervals of late has had the effect of cranking the national hysteria level to 11. There are those who examine the reports with a fine-tooth comb, uncovering what appear to many to be glaring inconsistencies, which lead to the inevitable charge of events being staged, being labeled false flags, presumably enacted for political gains such as an assault on the Second Amendment by an authoritarian government. Regardless of the merits of this angle, or its lack, this is not my focus here. Another topic, entirely different rabbit hole. These seeming acts of domestic terror are followed immediately by increased pressure to repeal or at least further encumber the Second Amendment, forgetting, of course, that rights aren't benefits. They were not granted by government and are therefore not supposed to be subject to restriction or outright repeal by political whim. Also seemingly forgotten are the millions of guns that are used for legitimate purposes, self-defense being foremost. This is when gun rights advocates enter the fray and the issue of mental illness is booted into the corner to make way for yet another epic clash over guns and gun rights. There are more than 300 million guns in private hands in the United States. It follows that there are many billions of rounds of ammunition at any given time. Since the streets are not littered daily with mountains of dead, it seems logical to conclude that guns and ammunition, by themselves, are not a problem. According to authorities, there are approximately 10 million Americans suffering severe mental illness. I think it's safe to assume only a tiny fraction are seriously contemplating mass murder. But put those two together, the violent mentally ill and guns, and you have a scary recipe. So, what should be done? Eliminate mental illness? Eliminate guns? Adding yet another law to the 20,000 plus existing federal gun laws seems pointless. Eliminate both? Doing effectively nothing doesn't seem to be a rational option, though sadly it appears to be standard operating procedure. Option 1. If you only eliminate guns and do nothing about mental illness, you are left with a handful of murderous, mentally disturbed patients in search of the next best weapon. Option 2. If you instead only eliminate mental illness, you are presumably left with gun owners with no desire to murder their fellow citizens, gang violence notwithstanding. I know which scenario I prefer. Exploring the both option, if you are somehow able to eliminate mental illness, what then is the point of eliminating guns? But I digress. Implementing the first option strikes me as impossible. Paradoxically, how would you accomplish this without using guns? You see, we're already off to a great start. Even if you somehow could, that approach reduces to some people being allowed to handle guns, while most won't. Military? Check. Police? Check. Bodyguards? They're allowed to have guns, right? If I'm allowed to use a gun, can I use it off hours, say to protect myself, my family? Why wouldn't everybody become a bodyguard then if they wanted to carry firearms? How is that dystopian scenario different than now? I hate stepping foot onto slippery slopes that never end well. You always end up in a bloody heap at the bottom of the hill. Guns won't magically vanish on their own. They won't rot. They are essentially low technology and therefore relatively easy to replicate. Hell, you can even print them these days. I just don't see how guns are not here to stay. So if option 1, eliminating guns, is not possible, that leaves only option 2, eliminating mental illness. More on that in a bit. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration estimates that there are roughly 500,000 homeless on any given night, and up to 25% of them are severely mentally ill. That amounts to well over 100,000 people suffering in abject poverty and mental anguish, with little hope of escape. As with mental illness and guns, this combination is also a scary recipe, with similar caveats. Eliminating poverty has proved practically impossible. The U.S. federal government has been officially fighting a war against this scourge since 1964, and yet poverty remains a major problem with 1 in 7 qualifying for that distinction, despite 15 trillion, that's a trillion with a T, 12 zeros trailing the 15, in cumulative welfare spending at the national level alone. Like before, eliminating mental illness leaves mentally healthy, albeit poor people, which I suggest is much better than mentally ill poor people. If you're still with me, I hope we're on the same page. In every social problem where mental illness plays a role, the squeakiest wheel never seems to be mental illness. Yet, I'm fairly certain many, if not most people, suspect therein lies the answer. I also sense that the reason the mental illness option is so quickly dismissed is a perceived futility in solving that puzzle within the conventional medical framework. Meanwhile, the options that are apparent non-starters are flogged for all they're worth. So rather than pointlessly continue to rail against guns or against poverty, my focus here is on mental illness. That, if you remember my opening remarks, is what already hasn't been said. Sounds stupid, right? I mean, who am I? I'm not even a doctor, and yet, as Sherlock Holmes observed, quote, "How often have I said to you that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, is the truth?" Close quote. It is clear to me that this is where the answers lie. So that's where I'm going. Care to join me down this rabbit hole? I've got a feeling it's pretty damn deep, but since I want real answers, there's not really much choice, is there? I maintain that the human brain is our least understood organ. That's not for a lack of trying, it's just a very complicated organ. We've come a long way from, "Burn her, she's a witch." But hey, I think it's fairly obvious, at least in my 2 examples, that mental health professionals are still nowhere near their stated destination. And if they're not even on the right path, as I've concluded, how will they ever reach it? Mental institutions closed their doors one after another after government funding dried up in the mid-1980s. President Trump has recently expressed interest in reopening at least some of them, and yet I can't help but think of them as prisons of a sort, a place to isolate violent, mentally ill patients from the rest of society. To me, that screams volumes about the state of mental health care. To me, long-term residence at such facilities is an admission of defeat. And just what is considered state-of-the-art in psychiatric care? Well, it seems that pharmaceuticals play a big role, but as is their nature, They are used to manage symptoms. They are categorized by their effect: antidepressant, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic, mood stabilizer, stimulant. Again, more clues as to how close doctors are to solving these problems. Unfortunately, it seems not very. I am sure that the symptoms of many patients can be, and are, controlled to the point that the patient can lead a mostly normal life. I'm happy for them. I can't even imagine suffering for years with a serious mental illness. Yet I can't help but think that all of them would choose cure over management were it available. Now for the $64,000 question. What causes mental illness? Seems to me that you really need to answer that question before any real lasting progress can be made, before we can expect real answers to the social nightmares of mass shootings and the downward spiral engulfing the mentally ill homeless. What other social issues are driven by underlying mental illness? I don't believe that any of these calamities are going away until that question is answered. I believe it to be the key, and you're not getting through the door without it. Are you with me? So, what does medical science have to say about the causes of mental illness? Mostly statistics. Uh-oh. Don't get me wrong, statistics can be very useful, but this indicates, to me at least, a profound lack of understanding of the actual cause. Ernest Rutherford, the father of nuclear physics, is quoted as saying, "If your experiment needs statistics, you ought to have done a better experiment." Precisely. It tells me that the doctors are nowhere near understanding the problem, and that symptom management is the best we can expect from them, at least for now. I imagine the drugs will continue to get better at dealing with the symptoms, but to me the signs are clear that the road they are traveling is a dead end. So, does anyone have an unambiguous answer to the question, what causes mental illness? Preferably one that doesn't require statistics. Spoiler alert, yes. Is it the answer? I don't know, I truly don't. My gut says yes, my reason says yes, but honestly, I'm fully aware of my medical ignorance, so I can only say I just don't know. This answer was discovered by a mainstream doctor over 30 years ago. I only first became aware of it 4 years ago, despite my appetite for all things internet. You would think that given the lack of clear guidance by conventional medical health authorities that formal inquiries would be afforded any cogent theory in an effort to overcome this problem. You would be wrong. It has been actively suppressed. The only way this discovery will reach a large audience is by a grassroots effort. This starts with you. I wrote a book exploring the cause of disease in general, which includes mental illness, and this heretic's discoveries. There wouldn't have been enough material for a book had he not discovered and then published truly compelling evidence of cause. Surprisingly, this is evidence that is discoverable by anybody. As it stands, the current mainstream explanations of the causes of mental illness are at best unclear, and at worst nonsensical, which does much to explain the subsequent ill-considered attacks on guns and poverty. I just don't see how the related social issues can be confronted in any meaningful way missing this crucial understanding. I, for one, grow weary at hearing the same tired, dead-end conclusions regurgitated every single time a shocking event of this kind raises the issue once more into the public eye. Yes, we should feel outrage, and I believe most have. Yes, we should demand progress, which has also been done. But you have to direct this frustration at the right goal. There is a simple reason our progress towards ridding ourselves of these nightmares reminds us of the movie Groundhog Day. For all those interested in arming themselves with knowledge necessary to finally stop this chaos, I invite you to read my book. Thank you for your interest.